in the event conflict breaks out between the United States and China, they want to be able to hit us first and effectively in taking out our energy delivery capabilities, our communication capabilities.
My guest on this episode is Andrew McCabe. He was a career FBI agent who became the deputy director of the FBI before being pulled onto the national stage when he became the active director of the FBI following James Comey's firing under then President Trump. He and I had a phenomenal chat about his history in the FBI, the events he witnessed that include 9/11, Benghazi, and the Boston bombings.
I think that's a reflection of how essential cyber capability has become in every part of our lives. And I think we're just really at the beginning of realizing how significant it will be if that infrastructure fails us.
We talked about cybersecurity, geopolitics, and even the controversial end to his FBI career.
Everything about it was wrong, but yet people don't know those details. So we made some very hard decisions to do that, knowing full well that many people would be unhappy about it.
Now, I found Andrew to be entirely genuine, incredibly open, and he's excited to still be engaged in public service as he's now focusing on cybersecurity. And now, here's Andrew McCabe. Hello.
Hey.
Welcome to the show. Thank you for being guest number one on our show called The Watchers.
Excellent.
And it's a fitting first guest because as I read your book and I've looked at your career, that's a great way to describe you, a watcher, someone who's been sort of on the wall in various different roles watching out for us.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I was very lucky to have a kind of broad career in the FBI. It's really the only thing I ever wanted to do. And, to be able to make that thing come true is phenomenal.
You didn't start as directly into the FBI.
No.
Right? You started in what feels like a different career field. Almost.
Yeah, so I went to law school right out of college, and I kind of got hooked on the FBI thing while I was in law school. So my summer between my second and third year, which is when you typically do like an internship at a big law firm,
sure,
hoping for it to turn into a job, I decided to come to DC to work for DOJ. And I tried to get into the honors program, and they would not have me.
At DOJ?
At DOJ, yeah. So I just said, okay, well, I'll just come and work for free. And I worked as a volunteer intern at DOJ for that summer, assigned to the criminal fraud section out of DOJ Maine. And so I spent the whole summer really reading FBI reports. I worked on a case, campaign finance violation case. What
was the form that you bring up in your book a lot? The FD 302, right?
Yeah, the
FD. A lot of time reading those.
FD 302, right? So big case had been going on for a long time. There'd been 1,000 interviews, and each interview gets recorded by an agent on an FD 302. It's just the write-up of the interview.
Sure.
And so I read just tons of these things, and I became like hooked on the idea of actually being in those conversations, to be there at the table with, business people, victims, former criminals, the walks of life that you could intersect with through the FBI just fascinated me. So I went back to law school to finish up my third year. When I graduated, the Bureau was under a hiring freeze. So I ended up going into the private sector, worked at a couple of law firms.
So would you have gone right into the FBI if you could?
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah, totally.
So it wasn't like you tried the corporate law thing and were kind of like, this isn't for me. Let me go to the FBI.
No, I wanted deeply to do it. When they opened up applications again, I put one in. It took 2 years to go through. So there were times there that I thought this isn't going to happen, but very, very lucky to get in 96, showed up at Quantico, did not know a single human being in the FBI. So it was like the beginning of the great adventure.
One of the things I loved, and my team that's in the studio is going to laugh at this. One of the things I loved is in your book, you describe Quantico, regimented, structured, talking about everyone's wearing the same polos. And like you thrived in that environment. You're like, yes, this is my cup of tea. Then your first assignment, Lower Manhattan, you said it's like the Wild West. And a quote I'm going to use all the time now is you said the best work happens late in the day there. Yes, that's my kind of thing. Because I'm a late start kind of guy. Like if it's before noon, I'm going through the motions.
Yeah.
And in the afternoon, I'm like, I'm on. I'm not a morning person at all.
Totally. New York is for you.
I was listening. I was like, all right, so FBI, you're describing it super structured. I'm like, okay, maybe not my thing. But then you describe that. And the mission focus there.
That really captures the differences that there are in the Bureau. Like you have Quantico, which kind of personifies the headquarters approach to everything, very stratified and, that sort of thing. And then you have the field where the work actually happens. Yeah. And it's kind of wild and woolly. It's like the Bureau runs basically on the energy of agents and analysts who, limited by their own creativity and determination, they're out there finding these threats that need to be mitigated, finding these crimes and victims and people who need our help. And you just kind of hit the ground and do it.
I love what you said too, like one of your first interactions there, or maybe an ongoing interaction in the Manhattan office, was someone saying like, don't bring the Quantico here, right? It's like, we taught you everything over here. Welcome to the field. This is how we really do things.
Totally. You show up, you think like, hey, 16 weeks, I learned everything. And then you realize you know nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
You get teamed up with the agents on your squad, and that's how you learn how the work is really done. I was super lucky because I worked on a squad that was run by a supervisor, who was a legend in the New York office. His name is Ray Kerr.
Yeah.
And just a phenomenal guy, a great investigator, but a great man. Like, he taught us how to develop, mentored us, turned us into not just investigators, but better people. And I hold Ray in just the absolute highest esteem to this day.
Yeah, you described him as something of a coach. Like, you guys were, for a time, the underdog team. You weren't working the high profile Italian mob stuff anymore, but you had, as you mentioned in the book, like sometimes as the underdog teams have, just a great coach, and that allows them to elevate their game so much.
Totally. We were the Russian Organized Crime Squad, rechanged the name halfway through to the Eurasian Organized Crime Squad to better reflect the breadth of the groups that we worked. And Ray was amazing. Like, he was there every day and into the night with us. And when we'd come back into the office after doing surveillance or, doing interviews out in the field and stuff, it was just a ritual. You would go into Ray's office, you and your partner, sit down in these two little chairs he had right across from his desk, and you would just walk through kind of everything that you had found, successes, failures, people who gave you good information, people who really didn't turn out to advance the ball for you. And he would just sit there and listen and ask questions and kind of point you very gently in the next direction. And that kind of hands-on leadership from the front, I just really responded to it. Everyone did. And the guy just had an amazing impact on the development of agents. So many folks who came through that squad went on to bigger positions of responsibility in the organization. And I think that's a tribute
maybe the prime example in front of me.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe the prime example, maybe the worst example. It depends on how you think about that. Sure. But I attribute so much of my ability in the Bureau to the things I learned from Ray.
So, young special agent, lawyer, Andrew McCabe in the Manhattan office in New York in the 90s, late 90s, Russian organized crime. There's a lot that happens in between when you get on the national stage. But we'll skip ahead for that for a moment, because I have to imagine your career, as I've read about it and heard you talk about it elsewhere, it's this kind of quiet, private, standard FBI career. Now you got a leadership track and you're involved in lots of activities, and it's kind of uncanny how many of the big moments in the last 30 years you were there for, right?
Yeah.
But the fact you were there for all those and no one really knew your name in the public space, and then to suddenly be foisted into the national light in controversy.
Yeah.
Like, what a, I don't know, that just seems like a really crazy change of pace, and I'm sure it happened very quickly.
Totally disorienting. I mean, I spent the first half of my career in New York doing Russian organized crime. Exactly the way you described. And that is the way that almost all FBI agents serve. It is not a job that you go into to get rich. You don't go into it to get famous, to become known.
You might have stayed a corporate lawyer if you really wanted to get super rich.
Totally, right? I mean, and that you can say that about everybody who's in the FBI. They all had other opportunities to maybe make more money or have easier jobs or whatever. But you come to the organization for the mission, and you stay for the people. And so I spent 10 years just doing that as an agent. And then I've eventually, Ray moved on to a different job, and I was able to become the supervisor on that squad for my last couple of years. It was great. Loved it. Probably best job I ever had in the Bureau. Working with the guys that I had come in with, my best friends in the organization. But for a variety of administrative reasons, I ended up having to go to headquarters. The Bureau kind of encourages field supervisors to go to headquarters to kind of move on into the leadership ranks. But continued to serve in that way, right? I flipped over into national security work when I got to headquarters, started doing counterterrorism work, and really continued, was able to work on amazing cases, some of the biggest investigations, that we had at that time, but you can continue to do that in a very quiet, normal way. You have, in the rare hours that you are home, you have a very normal life. It's not like being in the CIA where you live like undercover or anything like that. You're just in the community. People who know you work for the Bureau, but you don't talk about what you do. And it's all just very kind of containable. And then,
like that.
That. Yeah. The light switch flipped and, overnight, because of, I don't know, politics, insanity, whatever you want to call it, I became kind of more of a household name, which was just totally disorienting.
You definitely did. I mean, there was a good news cycle where you were something of a dominant story because you were getting, the coverage from the top, from the president, was really put you in the crosshairs for a while there.
Yeah, it did. It did. I mean, as deputy director, that's where I was when that happened. It's a much higher profile job. And so you do things occasionally, like you testify in front of Congress, you go up there a lot, briefing folks, spend a lot of time in the White House and meetings at the Situation Room, stuff like that on national security issues. So you're interacting with these high profile people, but you still maintain a pretty low, you're kind of not someone that people think
just a
about.
Guy.
But when the president of the United States starts to call you out on Twitter, it's over. Your anonymous life is over, whether you like it or not.
And then now I'm sure you've dealt with people trying to find you and find your family.
Totally.
And, share their identities and where they work and all things like that. Yeah,
it's really creepy. And it puts a lot of stress on your family. It's very tough on my kids. They were young when I went through that whole experience. I mean, they're still pretty young now. They're in college, but it was enormously stressful. Even in the months leading up to when I left the Bureau. And I don't know, on some level, I don't know that you ever kind of get over that.
Certainly not. I have to imagine after the long and storied career you had, to have it end that way. I'm sure no one envisions that, first of all.
Oh my God, no.
But it seems spiteful, from the people involved there. And it's not how anyone wants to tie the knot on their big career story.
We, like many organizations, have kind of a unstated tradition in the Bureau, right? When people retire, everybody from their work unit and their friends and stuff, you get together like in a conference room or something at work, and somebody brings in a cake, and usually that person who's retiring, their family comes in, and it's the infamous kind of retirement lunch, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I've been to hundreds of those, literally over the course of my career, hundreds. And as you get deep enough into your career, you get to a point where you start thinking like, what's it going to be like when I retire?
For sure.
I hope my parents are still around. I would see if they could come. I'd let my kids take the day off from school, to come in and kind of celebrate. And so you spend like so many years thinking, just kind of assuming that will happen. It definitely did not happen that way. I had planned to retire when I turned 50. That's kind of the rule in federal law enforcement. You're eligible to retire at 50, which is great because you can then kind of start a new career. So that was my plan, just to kind of retire quietly and then move into the private sector. But of course, none of that happened. There was no quiet about the way I left.
It wasn't quiet at all.
I mean, I'll be honest. It was like sickening. Yeah. It was just so unbelievably embarrassing, and everything about it was wrong, but yet people don't know those details.
Right, they get the sound bite.
They get the sound bite. They don't. It's like it would take us an hour and a half for me to go through exactly what happened and how it ended up where it did and why it did. And people don't really ever hear the why. They just hear the headline, and the headline was just, humiliating and sickening and awful. And
something of a character assassination was attempted.
Totally.
What I saw.
No, it was not just attempted, it happened, right? And I understand why they did it. I understand the pressure that DOJ was under at the time. There was no question that that's what President Trump wanted. I mean, he was very clear about that in his comments about me publicly and in things that he would say in private in the White House to people who I knew, who would then relate those things to me. So that was all bad, but it was particularly disappointing that the department, certain parts of the Department of Justice facilitated it, like knowingly.
Yeah.
And that's my family. The FBI is a component of the Department of DOJ. I worked so closely with people at DOJ my entire career. I had a lot of friends over there. And so to be kind of run over by that group of people was unbelievably disappointing. But that's what happened. And, I was very fortunate to be able to ultimately file a lawsuit against the Bureau and DOJ. And we settled that lawsuit very favorably, basically recovering. I went into it just wanting to recover what had been, what had been unfairly taken from me. And we did that. So I got my pension back and my health insurance and back pay. And I was actually unfired and reinstated.
So now you're officially retired.
Officially retired.
Right.
Yeah. It was a long way to get there.
Yeah, just a lot of noise in between there.
Yeah, you can't unring the bell. I mean, people will, there's always these trolls out there and social media land and everything who will constantly refer to me as, the fired former deputy and stuff like that. But I can't worry about that stuff anymore.
So as I've talked to you, as I've read your book and I've paid attention to you in the media a little bit, you come across as a very genuine, true believer. You talk about the mission being what motivated you into the FBI. And that's
totally.
You can be the consummate G-man and we can go your entire career without ever hearing about you. And you're not worried about that. You're like, hey, I did my thing. If no one ever knew Andrew McCabe was involved in all this, you're happy.
Yeah. Success.
And when I told someone close to me that you were going to be my first guest on this podcast, they responded that's kind of a controversial figure. To which I'm like, this is not someone who seems like they court controversy for fun or because they want to aggrandize themselves. You're very, you're a fairly in-demand media personality at this point. You're a CNN contributor. You have a lot that you can say and a lot of places you can go and people to talk to. You're at this little table, this little tiny startup podcast, which tells me hey, you're still in for the mission. You're still motivated the right way. You're certainly humble enough to sit at a table with me, which is phenomenal. And thank you, by the way, so much for that.
You're absolutely welcome. Thank you for having me.
If that's your character to then have this all happen, it's is there more of a nightmare scenario for you and how that all ends, if not this way?
You know what? Yeah, there's more of a nightmare. My family is still together, healthy, strong. My wife and I have an incredible relationship, which I never would have been able to navigate my entire career, and particularly the last part, without her love and support. And so lots of worse things could happen, right? People suffer with incredible challenges every day. The loss of a child or poor health and things like that. And so we had a very weird and kind of one-off challenge to struggle with, but we got through it and we're still here. We're still healthy. We're still enjoying life. And so at the end of the day, I'm doing fine. The controversy thing is really interesting to me. I'm glad you brought it up. I do think that a lot of people still see me that way.
I was surprised when someone said that to me. I was like, wait, he's like a career G-man. What?
Yeah,
is
I know.
Really that controversial?
It shouldn't be.
No.
But really, that's not me. That's politics.
Yeah.
That's the lens that, unfortunately, so many of us look at everything through now. And yes, I made some decisions about opening investigations and conducting investigations that people are still mad about. I understand that they disagree with some of the judgments that I made and that my team made. It's unfortunate that, we found ourselves in a place where the matters that we investigate were involving political figures. And that's how the Bureau, under normal circumstances, bumps up against politics. We don't pick who to investigate based on what team they're on or what party they represent. We don't gravitate towards politically tinged cases because we think they're fun or cool or they're going to make us famous or controversial. We certainly don't do it for that reason. But when we have information that a threat to national security may exist or that a violation of federal criminal law may have happened, it is our obligation to investigate. And so we made some very hard decisions to do that, knowing full well that many people would be unhappy about it and there would be likely fallout that impacted us personally. But I felt very strongly that that was our duty. And to not do that simply because of the political nature of the investigation would have been a dereliction of duty. That, to me, would have been politicizing our work.
Right. To
choose not to do our work because we were afraid of the political fallout would have been cowardly and failing to live up to our responsibilities. So we did it. And, if people still want to think of me personally as having been politically motivated, they're wrong. But people can have their own opinions. And if that means I do fewer podcasts, well, so be it. I'm happy to be on this one.
You're such a controversial figure. Yeah. Right. So I think that's what the American public, at least I'll speak for me, my one vote of 300 some million people now.
Your vote matters.
It does. Yeah. But this is what we want from our FBI, from our law enforcement, from our institutions. We want, again, speaking for myself, I want you to be impervious to the political will of the day because it changes so often.
That's right.
We need some consistency. And one of the things I had slated for maybe later in our discussion, but let's just go with it. Mm-hmm. It seems like trust in institutions is fairly low. Like from the highest institutions at the Supreme Court down all through the government, there's a lot of skepticism.
Yep.
There's a lot of conspiratorial thinking. There's, is Andrew McCabe part of the deep state? There's all that sort of silly stuff. But trust seems relatively low. And I don't do a lot in the larger institutions, but outside of my cybersecurity career, I'm a paramedic.
Sure.
And I volunteer and I've been in that world and I see how that world operates. And it's an institution and no one's ever malicious inside institutions that I find. And in my role in cybersecurity, now I've met a lot of people in the DoD and working for the government, and they're all seemingly well-motivated, just trying to do their job. And I'm always highly skeptical of people that are trying to say the institutions are failing, that they're in a state of mess, that they're staffed by incompetent people. I found none of that to be true in my experience. And I imagine yours must be the same.
That's consistent with my experience as well. I think that as a fundamental principle, we live in, by choice, a democracy. And we want to keep that democracy. And one of the things that's absolutely essential to maintain a healthy democracy are institutions. The institutions that protect the guidelines and the rules and the laws and how people function within a democracy. We've seen democracies failing all over the world over the last decade. And often they fail because very popular, kind of authoritarian leading leaders are elected, and then they use that populism, that popularity to attack and undermine the institutions that could hold them accountable. And I think that's an incredibly important example for us to acknowledge and think about here in the United States. The institutions, certainly the ones that I've worked with, are not pitted against one side or another. Now, they're also not perfect. They don't always function perfectly. There's ways they could be more efficient. There are certainly ways that a new administration comes in and they want to change the policy direction. They want to push things in a different direction, rethink how we fund our institutions, how much money we spend. That's all totally fair game. That's healthy, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes people make bad decisions and need for personal reasons, and they need to be removed from institutions or held accountable criminally. That happens because it's human beings that run these things. But when we start attacking institutions and tearing them down and undermining public faith in things like law enforcement and the courts, we really encourage that sort of conspiratorial thinking that just tears us apart. And it's all to the benefit of the politicians who seek to maintain a hold on power. Yeah. If you look across what we're experiencing in this country right now, the people that are screaming and yelling about politics and things becoming politicized are the politicians who use those claims to maintain their own hold on power. So like, because a bunch of politicians stand up and say, we're going to investigate the weaponization of the FBI. I mean, it's nonsense. It doesn't happen. And if you look at the cases that the FBI has engaged in over the last year, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, you'll see that they are not guided by a political will. But the people who are put those hearings on and handpick witnesses to come in and deliver testimony that's going to create sound bites, they're doing it for a political reason. So it's just something we really have to be cognizant of.
No, that's highly concerning. And I think a lot of people seem to be cheering on the institutional attacks. There's something about a bloodlust that personally, I don't really understand where it comes from. When I think back, especially I've been revisiting history of my life and listening to your book, and sort of tracking all these big national moments that the FBI is a critical part of, where you're just a stable part. We all sort of take it for granted that these guys will show up, these guys and ladies will show up, be competent, and achieve what we need them to achieve. And now to be this political, controversial thing, it was something that for the longest time we just assumed was there, was competently run, did its thing.
Right. And I think that's a fair assumption, particularly in the post-Church Committee era, right? In the FBI of like, let's say 1980 forward, after the Hoover years. Because before that era, it was a politicized institution because J. Edgar Hoover was incredibly adept at playing the political cards for his own advantage. Yeah. And the Bureau was engaged in all kinds of activity that it should never have been engaged in, particularly on the domestic intelligence side. But what was the public impression of the Bureau at that time? Gee, man, everything's good. We can count on the FBI. They didn't know that the Bureau was conducting illegal surveillance of political figures and political opponents of the administration. They didn't know that the Bureau was being essentially weaponized by every president, from FDR forward. Not just Democrats, not just Republicans, all of them. And it wasn't until after we came out of that period and embraced leadership that acknowledged the importance of oversight and acting within the law that we became the Bureau that people understand today, that you can rely on to do the right thing, to tell the truth. We're going to make a mistake every now and then. Yes, human beings, right? Of course. We make mistakes. But it is an institution whose character and integrity you can rely on. That is still true today. It breaks my heart that so many people out there have kind of lost that faith. But I am confident that it will come back.
Yeah. And for me, I imagine that confidence comes from the fact the people in those institutions still. Yeah. Their motivations, what gets them to work every day.
Totally. None of them came into it for politics. Right. None of them stay for politics. They're literally there to put bad guys in jail. That's what they love. And thank God they are, because they keep us safe.
Yeah, they're watchers on the wall.
For real.
So you were in the FBI for a lot of big moments, and I want to explore a couple of those big moments. Mm-hmm. Chronologically, the first one that really registers for me is, of course, 2001, 9/11. I was fairly young then. I won't say how young, but I was a kid.
You'll depress me.
I was not legally able to vote at the time. That was the beginning of my journey into understanding anything about politics or the world. Sure. As a kid, that was suddenly on front stage. Mm-hmm. That, wait a minute, the country I live in is a target. People want to hurt us over what? And, go down that deep pathway. So such a seminal moment in my life that there's like a before 9/11 and there's an after.
Totally.
And the way I've heard it told and the way you kind of talk about it in your book is there's an FBI before 9/11. There's a federal government before 9/11, and then there's an after. I didn't realize you were in New York.
Yes.
During 9/11.
Yeah, I was there. Still doing criminal work, street agent on the Russian OC squad. And I was also on a member of our SWAT team in the New York office. So SWAT is like a corollary duty. It's like an extra responsibility when you're an agent.
Did you learn those skills in law school, or do they teach you that?
Learn none of that at law school. None of it. Yeah. So, on the team, you would typically deploy out for like high risk arrests and things like that, protection details, all kinds of really cool work. I absolutely loved it. It was so much fun. And I remember that morning thinking, like, we rallied on the West Side Highway at this like little turnout. The West Side Highway got closed because they didn't want any more traffic, obviously, coming into Lower Manhattan. And so we grabbed all of our gear and our trucks and kind of staged at this little parking area off the side of the highway. And we stood there all day. We thought, any minute now, we're going to start getting a list of warrants, people to go out into the community and pick up and bring in for investigation. Never happened. We stood there all day. It was just like, as the day wore on, this dread started to set in. Like, we're not going to be able to fix this today. This is a paradigm shifting moment. The people who participated in this are dead. Now the hunt begins for the people who directed them, who funded them, who helped them travel, helped them plan, helped them train themselves and others. And we are at the jump off point of a war against this enemy that looks like us, that exists everywhere, that doesn't wear uniforms, that can travel into our country and attack our own systems from within. And the FBI, for us in the FBI, institutionally and I think individually, it was a wake-up call. It was like, we have got to step up our game and really mature into the intelligence agency that this nation needs us to be to fight this war on terror effectively. And we did that. It took us a long time. It was a evolution, not a revolution. But yeah, it's a very different FBI today than it was before 9/11.
Yeah, it's almost like it goes from the big national law enforcement agency to a big element of our counterterrorism task force. Like it becomes a counterterrorism agency at that point. Or at least a acute focus for a while.
So we'd always done counterterrorism work as like a kind of a niche within the national security side of the Bureau. But the focus then on Al-Qaeda and all affiliated groups became the number one priority of the FBI. Number one priority to this day is still to prevent an act of terrorism in the United States or against U.S. citizens anywhere. And that will never change.
You describe a moment in your book that stuck with me. You're, I think, going over the FDR bridge. I don't know, New York City. You said something, I think it was FDR. And you're one of the few cars going into the city at this point. And you're crossing, and on the other side, opposite direction traffic is people. And you describe them like ghosts, just sort of like covered in white dust and just in a state of daze and shock, just sort of walking across, no talking, no excitement. It wasn't very animated, just sort of like dealing with that daze. That image, I can see it. And I can't imagine what it was like being there. It
was unbelievable. I was at home when the planes hit. I'd been at work very late the night before and got in my car when the plane hit the first tower and started heading in. Came over the Triborough Bridge to get into Manhattan. It was completely blocked up. It was already closed. And so I got like on the side of the road and was trying to get around the traffic, kind of the red lights and sirens going. And I was blocked by those, those big orange cans that they use around construction sites. So people saw me blocked by these cans. They just started jumping out of their cars and throwing this stuff, the obstacles out of the way so I could get to work. Got on the FDR, which is the highway that runs along the east side of Manhattan, heading downtown. Not a single car going there because it was closed. And that's when I saw that procession of people who were fleeing Lower Manhattan and who had been there when the towers came down and were covered in dust, head to toe, white, like statues, right, that you would see in a museum, and carrying their briefcases, lunch boxes, overcoats, whatever. It was a pretty warm day by then, and just walking silently up the ramp to the FDR Drive and onto the highway and then north on the highway by the hundreds, just people on their own 2 feet fleeing terror silently. It was just so eerie. Yeah, I don't know that I'll ever forget it.
No, and it's getting to be fairly distant in history. I think 23 years now, this September. And you can kind of start to forget about it having seen it through a TV and being a young kid, it's of course a big piece of my memories, but I wasn't there for it. Right. And it's easy to start to put some of that sort of behind you, but having been there and seeing the people and live in the flesh, and then to be intricately involved in the aftermath and seeing what went into that. I mean, just, can you still put yourself there?
Totally. I mean, it's a life-changing event for anybody that was involved in it. I teach a class at George Mason University every spring in national security law and policy. And one class is focused on 9/11. It's about how events change the national security direction. And I always start by talking about 9/11, and I ask my students to tell me about like their memories of 9/11. As years go on, the memories most students now are like, well, I was 5. So I don't really remember it that well, which is unfortunate, but maybe also a good thing. I don't know. But for those of us who lived through it, I don't think you'll ever forget. It's one of those moments in time that it wasn't just what we experienced that day, but it was how deeply it changed us in the days going forward. And I kind of knew at that point, it was only a matter of time before my own work, which had always been exclusively criminal work, would have to change, and I'd have to get into this fight on the national security side, which of course I did just a couple of years later.
Yeah, in remembering it and like some of what you just said, I get little goosebumps just because I can remember where I was, what we saw, what the people's reactions were. And I remember the rest of the day and just how different it was. And seeing my mom when she came home from work that day, like you could see in her face, I'm like, oh, this is like really bad. Yeah. And it was like a different world the next day.
So when I came to headquarters, my first job down here was in counterterrorism division. I had a small unit, and we were responsible for what we call extraterritorial cases in the FBI. Those are FBI investigations of people who are overseas. And so we had a certain part of the world that we monitored and managed those cases in. And as soon as I arrived, I knew nothing about terrorism work, right? I couldn't even spell FISA. Like I had no idea what I was doing. So it was a huge learning curve. And about a month or two after I got here, my unit got assigned a case that later we ended up calling Operation Overt. And it was the case of the British Al-Qaeda followers who intended to bomb US-bound airliners, the airliner plot. And we followed that very closely. We worked very closely with our colleagues in the UK. And when our British colleagues brought the case down, so they arrested the guys in England before they could actually execute the plan. I remember in the lead up to that, working with them on what we were going to tell our airline safety infrastructure, how to do things differently to protect against specifically this sort of plot, bringing liquid explosives onto a plane. And so the day the case came down, that guidance had gone out. And I remember driving to work probably at like 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And already like air traffic had come to a halt on the Eastern Seaboard and in the UK. And suddenly you couldn't bring liquids on a plane. You had to take your shoes off. The whole thing just got ramped up overnight. And I just remember driving to work thinking, my God, it's another one of these moments where like something I'm working day to day has just completely changed the way people will interact with airline travel forever. It's just a really weird feeling to be that close to something that has an impact on so many, really everyone's lives. If you
being the butterfly and the butterfly effect there. Seeing how that cascades.
It's like, there is definitely that moment where you're like, oh my God, did we get this right? I hope this wasn't wrong. But obviously it was something that we needed to do then and we still do to this day. So
a lot of moments in your career, I mean, just there's got to be such insane pressure. Right. Yeah. You go from being involved in the aftermath of something like 9/11, and then toward the end of your career, you're briefing presidents, you're meeting presidents, shaking hands with them, giving briefings. And one of the anecdotes you shared with me before we recorded was talking to President Obama and him being very engaged. Yeah. And was prepared to call you on anything that you were inconsistent about, which talk about pressure.
Totally. Very different kind of pressure, but like all these jobs in the intelligence community, the FBI and CIA, all the agencies are there's a lot on the line, because ultimately what you're doing it to protect people's lives.
Right.
And so if you don't get it right, it's disastrous. And you have to be right every single time. The adversary only has to get it right once. They only have to hit the target once.
The cybersecurity people right now hear that, because we say the same thing.
Exactly. They can take 1,000 shots. In cybersecurity, hundreds of millions of shots and only land one of them. And that's a absolute 100% success for them. Yeah. And we have to bat back every single shot. And if one gets through, it's a total failure. So yeah, the margins are very, very thin. And so I've had the opportunity to see like really different and impressive leaders in different environments. And it's from watching those people and seeing the way they work, like that's how I figured out how to lead. By seeing what other people did and copying it, stealing it, right?
Absolutely.
Somebody does something, it works well for them. You think, I'm going to start doing that. Like, I feel like that's like the most fundamental kind of learning. And so I always tried to kind of like make observations about people who I thought were impressive leaders. And President Obama, who I only met a couple of times, and had the opportunity to sit in the Situation Room at the table, briefing him on a couple of issues. The thing that really stuck out to me initially was that National Security Council process is very formalized. And before you go to the meeting, if you are presenting on any issue, you have to submit what we call read ahead. So that's memos and charts and, nowadays like videos on iPads and stuff like that, because we're all super high tech, we think. So you have to submit that stuff ahead of time. So a day or two before that goes in. And, if the principal that you're briefing gets around to reading it, you're super lucky. It doesn't always happen because like they have a lot going on and there's a lot of materials that they are buried with every day. And so the first thing I noticed about President Obama was he had read everything. Like, it was so clear. Anyone who spoke at the table, he was able to converse with them on their very specific subject matter in detail, like citing things that they had stated in their previously submitted materials. Like I just thought like, wow, he really did the work. He did the preparation. He's read all this stuff and he's kind of taken it on board and is able to transact on it. And so when it got to be my opportunity, I started talking about, it was actually an issue involving the accessibility of firearms to people who are here illegally and how people can come in contact with firearms. And if they do get them, how that impacts their immigration status, if they have any, stuff like that, very technical kind of immigration and firearms law related things. And so when the conversation turned to that, he just immediately looked at me and said, well, Andy, I didn't even know he knew my name. And he starts firing questions at me and I'm doing my best to kind of,
that's why I feel the pressure. It's like, that's way more intimidating.
I'm like, oh my God, he actually knows. I can't just like bluff my way through this. This guy seems to know as much about this as I do. And so then we got into this very direct conversation about some aspect of immigration law. And he's like a true law professor. He's like pushing me with like hypothetical. We're narrowing down the issue. And then, I got to the resulting answer, which was not the one he wanted. And he just paused for a minute and looked at me and then said, that's crazy. He just threw his hands up. And I said, yeah, it is. It is crazy, but that's the law right now. Like, that's what we have to work with. And so we had this very like weirdly personal exchange in the middle of this, National Security Council meeting. And so I was kind of not blown away by it. And I remember going home later that night and I'm in my kitchen, like eating dinner, and the news is on in the background. And there's President Obama. He's on TV. He's the president. He's on TV a lot. He was doing a town hall in some place in the Midwest. Obviously, they had taken him to after our meeting. And someone asked a question along the lines of what we had discussed. And he launched into like comments repeating back to these people in the town hall the very thing that I had told him earlier that day. So like his ability to kind of process all that information and then access it and use it effectively, it was like, oh my God, this guy, he's a real deal.
Yeah, I'd be put on notice like, oh, okay, I can't ever try to come at him with anything but my absolute best.
You got to bring your A game. And that's what good leaders do, right? He's not scary or threatening. He's a very nice guy, very congenial, first name basis type of person. I mean, he uses your first name. You call him Mr. President, of course. So he's not pushing you to that with threats or fear or intimidation. It's just you see what he's able to deliver and it inspires you to bring your A game and really leave no stone unturned. And that's what you need to do, especially in something like security, national security, cybersecurity. So yeah, I thought it was I learned a lot from him in that very brief interaction.
Does young Andrew McCabe ever imagine being able to share an anecdote about meeting the president of the United States?
No. Are you kidding me?
That's nowhere in your trajectory where you're like, I'm joining the FBI and I'm going to end up briefing presidents.
You know, I left the law to go in the bureau because that's what I wanted to do. And I kind of convinced people around me like, oh, I'm just going to do it for a few years. And then maybe I'll try to go, get a job in a U.S. attorney's office.
There was some pushback when you brought this up from family.
Yeah, from some family members who were a little concerned that maybe like, oh, you'd gone to all this trouble to get a law degree. Now you're just going to be a cop. Like, what's the deal?
You're going to take a big pay cut.
Yeah, a big pay cut. But I was like, well, I'm going to do this for a couple of years and then I'll go try to maybe be a U.S. attorney or something like that, an assistant U.S. attorney. And almost as soon as I got in the bureau, I was like, I'm not going anywhere. I love this. I love this place. I love these people. And I thought I'll just do this forever. My wife is a physician and she was in a private practice where we lived in New York. And I just assumed like we would never leave New York. I would just stay in New York and be an agent my whole career. I was like totally happy with that. So no, I did not think I would ever, be the deputy director and going to the White House and briefing presidents on things. That was just like... Is
it surreal still sometimes?
Totally, yeah.
I can't imagine being where you're sitting and just that culmination of experience and then to be able to reflect on, I've met multiple presidents, I've shaken hands, they know me.
It's kind of crazy. Been around the globe, meeting with world leaders, certainly security and intelligence leaders in more countries than I can count. But really having been able to touch cases and investigations that, change to some extent, change the way we live in a positive way. I mean, like that's the greatest part of it. The rest of it is all fun, but, it was always totally unexpected.
You work some other big cases that, there's like three big ones that come to my mind when I think about the FBI of the last 20, 30 years. There's of course 9/11. There's Benghazi.
Sure.
Which I understand you were a part of. And,
yes.
And then the Boston bombing as well.
Yeah. I mean, those three, I think, really stand out because they are so publicly known. There were many, I start thinking about these things and I go down a rabbit hole and I start remembering cases I haven't thought about in years. But even the cases that we did with the military in taking terrorists overseas into custody and bringing them to the United States to stand trial. We basically kind of invented that process as we went during the Obama administration, during those years. And we developed that into an incredibly effective tool, not just for us, but for our partners in the war on terror. Particularly partners in the UK and in Europe whose legal systems really were at a challenge to address some of these terrorist threats. And
difficulty with extradition and things like that.
Yeah. So through an incredibly close relationship with the military and particularly special forces elements within the military, we were able to come up with a model that we used many times to take like really serious terrorist threats off the battlefield. And not squirrel them away in some black site or hand them over to another nation to do whatever they wanted with them, but to bring them back here and subject them to the fairest criminal justice system on earth, and allow their cases to be heard publicly evidence presented publicly, and let a jury of Americans decide whether this person goes to prison for the rest of their lives or goes free. And so I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, the way you said that, very convicted, and that's how I feel our justice system should be. Go back to the current state of things today. You do have, again, there's something of a bloodlust out there that some people seem to have where they'd be happy to circumvent that. They don't want to get too political, but I guess some people don't see the value in subjecting someone who is morally awful, a terrible human being who we, don't want to have around, but to force them through our justice as opposed to vigilante type justice.
Of course.
That's the ultimate, is we put them through our justice. And that's way more powerful than sort of reactionary.
I mean, that's why we're here. That's how we became a country.
Right.
Because the first settlers had to deal with the repression that they were under from the Brits, our good friends, the Brits.
Are now good friends.
I used to bring this up with them all the time. But they'd be angry at me about not being able to take something off the internet. And I'd be like, no, that's because we have this thing called the First Amendment. Remember, that's what we fought you over. I mean, prior to the Constitution, we were subjected to the whims of the king, who could basically throw anyone in prison for any reason he wanted for as long as they wanted without a probable cause hearing or without habeas corpus rights and things like that. So our founders got together and came up with a better way to do it that was fair to everyone, that subjected everybody to the same laws and gave everyone the same rights. And one of those rights is when there's probable cause to believe you've committed a crime, you are indicted, and then you can be put on trial, and you're judged by a jury of your peers, not some,
royal
rich
appointee
landlord or royal in another country. And you have rules of evidence and the right of confrontation of witnesses and all the other things that our system guarantees defendants. And ultimately, that free and fair jury makes a determination of the facts. The judge decides the law, and if you're convicted, great. If not, you continue to be innocent because you're innocent until convicted. Like the beauty, the majesty of that system is so important. And when we attack that institution, we undermine its effectiveness and its importance and its ability to serve, I think, as a model for the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think about at that level, that geopolitical level, and projecting power being a strategic interest of the United States to project our power. And sometimes we do something like we can put an advanced munition on a target in another country and eliminate said person. I think there's a pretty significant power projection to say, no, we can take you from where you're at. We can bring you here. And you're going to sit in a courtroom where American jurors are going to judge what you've done and sentence you and whatnot. That to me seems like the ultimate projection of power. Like, we can't just hit you there.
Right.
We can bring you here, and we're so principled, we're going to put you through as if you were one of us.
So Abu Khatala, who was one of the principal architects of the attack on our special mission facility in Benghazi, was one of those people. We were able to send, the military was able to send an incredibly skilled team into Libya, onto the coast of Libya, to take him into custody, to spirit him away to a U.S. military ship, bring him back here to the United States. We were able to subject him to lawful interrogation along the way. And when he arrived here in the United States, he was presented to a judge in federal court in New York City, in the Southern District of New York. He was ultimately put on trial, where the evidence that had been lawfully obtained from him was presented against him, and he was convicted. And he now serves a life sentence in this country for that attack that killed our citizens in Benghazi. That's the way it should be done. It's not always possible to do it exactly that way, but it is an incredibly powerful tool that we should always have in the toolbox. That's one option. It's not always the best option. Sometimes we find ourselves in conflict that it's just too dangerous to put people into that sort of jeopardy. But nevertheless, when we can use it effectively, I think it's very, very powerful.
So you described the FBI as people who want to put bad guys in jail, essentially. Like that's a motivator. And the story you just told, how satisfying that must be. That's the ultimate bad guy to put in jail. I mean, foreign adversary, attack on foreign soil, high profile attack. that led to a lot of criticism from the public of our institutions from the top down. And then to have that as one of the outcomes that, well, we found a guy who did that. He's serving his sentence here on our soil, and our institution secured that from the guys on the ground to the prosecutors and the jurors.
It's incredibly powerful. It takes a long time and a ton of work. So we literally sent agents to Libya in the immediate aftermath, and they worked under incredibly austere conditions. Remember, because our embassy was officially shut down. Right. You couldn't leave the grounds without a massive caravan of security people. There was no host nation law enforcement entity that we could actually work with to do an investigation. So they had to, from the ground up, make contacts with people in government who could help them find people who were involved or who were witnesses of or victims of these attacks. And I remember testifying on the Hill in the immediate aftermath of the attack. And, we were getting just crushed. I went through a lot of these hearings with former DNI Clapper, who's a good friend of mine. And we still have the same scars from this experience. But there was just such an immediate, screaming for answers. Where are people? We want people arrested. We want accountability. And to have to go in there and say, we want that too, and we're going to get it, but it's going to take a long time. We have a lot of work to do just to figure out who was there, who was involved, and who was in charge, and who was just just kind of a mope, as we say, on the ground. So it's not very satisfying initially, and the Bureau has done this time and time and time again over its history. If you just stay at it, and you follow the rules and you're as aggressive as you can possibly be within what's acceptable in terms of how we investigate, you just chip away at it, never lose sight of that target. And eventually you can get there. And we did in that case.
You'd be some stubborn people.
Heck yeah. Heck yeah.
And you got to be okay with FD 302s. Is that right?
FD 302s are going to be cranking those things out.
That comes up a lot in your book. You talk back to those, and that's in the intro. You talk about as if you were writing the story of Andrew McCabe on the FD 302.
Yeah. So I kind of redrafted that for the book. When you're coming in and you sit down for your interview in the agent application process, of course, a 302 is created as a result of that interview. So I kind of redrafted
somewhere in the files.
A 302 just like that is hiding somewhere in the Hoover building.
Never got subpoenaed. They never tried to do anything crazy like that.
I guess not. I don't know. If they haven't set it on fire and thrown it out the window yet, it's still hiding in a file somewhere.
Hopefully. So you were also present for the Boston Marathon bombing. And in the response to that, tell me a bit about that. Yeah.
So I was not in Boston. I was working at headquarters. At the time, I was the head of the counterterrorism division. And I was actually in a meeting at the White House. So the heads of counterterrorism kind of responsibilities at all the agencies would get together every Thursday for like a working group meeting at the old executive office building in the White House complex. And I remember getting there and just kind of sitting down in the room. It's in a SCIF, so you have like the lock bags with your classified documents and stuff in them. And sitting down and kind of getting my stuff together. And somebody came in and said, did you hear about the bomb? That's not ever what you want to hear when you're running,
especially not in that room.
When you're running counterterrorism for the FBI, if there's a bomb and you have not heard about it, that's a problem. So I'm like, no. And what's going on? And the person who had come in said apparently 2 bombs went off at the Boston Marathon this afternoon, just, immediately prior to the meeting. So I just picked my stuff up, stuck it back in the bag and took off. And that kind of was the beginning of a very, very busy week of trying to help the field office, conduct a very challenging investigation from the beginning. I mean, you have a crime scene that's a couple blocks long.
Right.
And was populated by tens of thousands of people. And the devices were both concealed in backpacks. And pretty much all of those tens of thousands of people had backpacks or bags which they dropped in the street as they ran for their lives. So now you have a bombing crime scene filled with thousands of potential additional devices. So just clearing the scene so we could get investigators in to actually start collecting forensic evidence that would ultimately bring us back to the perpetrators was enormously challenging. The job from that level at the Counterterrorism Division is to kind of oversee the field office's progress on the investigation, and also to push them every resource and capability imaginable that they need. And many of those are things that they don't even know they need right away. And so we did that over the course of several days as the investigation just grew and grew and grew. Kind of got out of control for a while because we had this incredible public interest and a very aggressive media kind of following us every step of the way, which led to the false...
That's what I remember about it.
Yeah, it led to the false identification of people as potential subjects. And those people were subjected to like kind of horrible conditions as a result of that attention. So it was really chaotic. But some incredible work by analysts in the Bureau and particularly in the Boston field office were able to uncover video footage of Joe Carr, the younger brother, in a moment that still haunts me to this day. Outside the Forum restaurant, there was a restaurant along Boylston Street where people had gathered to watch the runners coming in. That's like the lead up to the finish. And we knew that one of the devices had been placed next to a mailbox right in front of the Forum restaurant. And so we got video capture from across the street that showed a tall, skinny guy with a white baseball hat on backwards come up and stand right in that area. So that gave us the idea to try to get the Forum restaurant security coverage from inside the restaurant that was looking out at the crowd where they had some tables on the sidewalk. And bingo, there he was. You saw him walk up with the backpack on his shoulder, and he kind of inserts himself into the crowd right there by the mailbox. And you can see at one point he looks, I think, to the left and sees there's a person with a child in a stroller, baby carriage. Looks at the kid and then takes the bomb off and places it on the ground.
Jeez.
And just like, oh my God. Like,
doesn't get more awful than that.
Yeah, like how cold-hearted.
Yeah.
Put a bomb on the ground next to a child. So, and then you hear the detonation of the first bomb, which is up the street to the left at the finish line. And everyone in that little group standing on the sidewalk at the Forum restaurant, instinctively like jerks to the left to look to see, oh my God, what was that? Only one person doesn't look left. It's the only person who wasn't surprised by it. He looks to the right and then walks off camera to the right. And then, of course, he pulls the radio detonator out of his pocket and detonated the device. So, yeah, I mean, it was just incredible work to identify. And then it was a challenge of figuring out, okay, now we know who it was. We were able to follow video capture all the way kind of backwards down the street and see him walking into Boylston Street with his brother. So we knew we could identify. We had good pictures of the two of them, but we didn't know who they were. And that of course led to our release of their photographs on Thursday. And then Thursday night was the crime wave across Boston.
So you remember the day of the week?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's like it just happened.
Yeah. Yeah. That was all Thursday night. I had gone home Thursday night about midnight. I maybe was asleep for like an hour, and I got called from the command post. And they said, I was like, what do you have? And they said, we're not sure, but there was just a carjacking, I don't remember whether I was in Cambridge or near Cambridge. And now we're hearing over the radio that there's some sort of a police shooting. We're not sure if it's connected, but things are, heating up here. So I jumped out of the bed, threw the suit back on, hopped in my car and drove in about 120 miles an hour. which is easy to do at that hour in the morning. And that started Friday, the infamous manhunt, which ended, Friday night when they pulled Dzhokhar out of that boat all shot up.
Yeah, I can see that image in my brain.
The boat is still over at headquarters.
Oh, yeah?
It's part of the FBI tour. At least it was the last time I was there, which was a couple of years ago. But the boat with all the bullet holes in it, and it's pretty
interesting piece of FBI lore.
Interesting piece of FBI history to be able to see, very close.
When something like that happens, certainly on our own soil, is there an institutional reaction or a questioning of like, how did this happen on our watch? Is that something that people deal with either personally as an institution? Like, I don't know if it's feelings of guilt or a lot of introspection on what could we have done to catch this?
One of the reasons why I found counterterrorism work so incredibly satisfying, despite the pressure, the hours, it's a 24-hour-a-day job, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. You never escape that level of responsibility. You are constantly motivated by finding the next Boston bombing before it happens. And you have to understand that you are doing that as you receive an infinite number of threats and intelligence streams from around the world coming in constantly. Yeah. Cable traffic from all of our U.S. intelligence community friends, from foreign governments, from all the, really high-speed work that our government and military does overseas. Excuse me. And the thing that drives counterterrorism professionals is what we talked about before, constantly staying ahead of the threat and not letting something happen. So when something does happen, people take it very, very personally. And even though they're kind of worked to death on a daily basis anyway, when that moment happens, that workforce responds in ways that you can't imagine. They will do anything. They'll work forever. Every single person wants to start working the crisis from the first minute. One of the tough things that you have to do as a leader is like draw a line. And like when something happens, you have to cordon off some of your team and send them home. Like, okay, you guys go home and get sleep because you're coming back in at 4 a.m. or whatever. And you have to be disciplined about how you use your people because their time and attention and energy and life is a limited resource. And so after navigating crisis after crisis, you kind of learn these things as you go. But one of the things I learned about the people who did this every day was like, if it's you learn so much from your first crisis response. And the teams, the units or the groups that are responsible, they're really on point for those issues. They come so far through that experience. They are faster, smarter, tougher, more resilient the next time. You would think by having like that beating, they'd be dispirited and like morale would be low. Consistently, year after year after year, counterterrorism like had the top morale of any division in the FBI. And I believe it's because of that. They go through fire together and it breeds a level of camaraderie and shared experience that just cannot be replaced.
Yeah, I see a lot of that. So my other life as a paramedic, I've been around doing that for 15 years or so. And like anything else, it becomes day to day, sort of the same. You go to the same sort of call.
Sure.
And it can become fairly routine. But then there will be those moments, the big incidents for us, where the whole system comes together, all the personalities, think like big car accident, big incident like that. And you see that in people. Everyone's in it, in the moment and focused, and they're all mission oriented and they know their job.
It's inspiring.
Yeah. And like there's a rush when there's something big going on, even still at the station I'm at now. People come in if they weren't planning to be there. If there's something going on, there's a page out for help. Say, hey, we just need bodies. People show up and they're, we don't relish in it, but it's what I've prepared for.
Totally.
So like I want to be there.
If you're drawn to that work at all, you're drawn to it because you want to respond.
Absolutely.
You want, when the bell rings or the guns start firing, you run to that sound because like that's why you came.
Exactly.
I remember when I was a young, confused lawyer working at a small firm in Camden, New Jersey, like right out of law school, which I really didn't want to be there. It was a nice place and I worked for nice people for sure. But I remember when the Oklahoma City bombing happened, and like I just sat in my office and listened to radio. This is pre-satellite radio days, back in ye olden times. I sat there listening to like the local news station, and they were just like nonstop about Oklahoma City. And I just was like, oh my God, like I felt it then. Like I wanted to be there. I didn't know what I could do. I had really nothing I could contribute at that point, but I just thought like, there's no place on earth that you could be of more help, you know, than at the rim of that smoking hole, as we say in counterterrorism. But yeah, if you're inclined to do that kind of work, that's why it's so gratifying, I think, because even though it's hard and stressful and it's, you know, not financially the most rewarding, but it just rewards you in so many other ways.
Do you think that's something in your character, just part of like who you are, or is that something that you think was instilled in you?
I think it's kind of who you are. You know, it's like any other preference, like what you're drawn to, what your passions are, what your interests are. I'm not really motivated by like money and numbers and stuff like that. I think that's why I never really was into, when I was practicing law, I was not that enthusiastic about it, because like ultimately civil law is like everybody's just fighting over money. And I was like, who cares really? But I was always drawn to criminal law because it's like passion and power and violence and, you know, aberrant behavior. And it's the place where you can ask the questions like, why? How did this happen? Why did it happen? How can we make sure that it doesn't happen again? So yeah, this just draws me in. I also kind of like, in a weird way, I like functioning under stress. I feel like I'm better under a certain amount of pressure. I make better decisions. I feel like my perspective on things is a little bit sharper. 100%. Like when I don't have a lot going on and I'm not under a lot of stress, I have a tendency to drift a little bit. I get distracted. So you have to, I used to tell this to leaders in the Bureau that on some level, especially like running a field office or a division where you're going to be kind of in the chair making decisions in a crisis, you have to be somebody who's comfortable with chaos. You have to know that like the information you get initially is never right, but it's the best you have. You have to like set a pace, stay on it, make decisions quickly, keep people focused, but understand that it's like a wild ride that you kind of can't control. And some people really don't like that. If you're like a real control freak and you have to have, you know, all your pencils lined up on the table and stuff, it's maybe not the best position for you. No,
it's so funny. The way you describe it's a way that I've described to, you know, young paramedics and EMTs coming up in that world. Scenes are chaos and you never know what you're showing up to. The 911 call can come in and sound super calm. Everything's okay. And you get there and things are on fire. And it's pandemonium. And then the reverse is true. You get all amped up on your way to a call and then you get there. Everyone's like, everyone's fine. But you have to be able to function in that chaos. And, you know, I personally find that I thrive in it. And cybersecurity is another area where it's at similar level. Like, okay, today it could be ransomware. Today it could be a nation state attacking a business. It could be the sort of the run of the mill. And personally, I'm drawn to that. I think there are personalities who are into that and there are some who aren't.
Yeah. I mean, and that makes sense. Like it doesn't appeal to everybody. There's definitely downsides to it. It can wear you out and it's tough on your family and your private life and everything else. But there's also kind of an exhilaration that comes from it.
Yeah. I tell people still, I've been a paramedic. I've been in fire and EMS as a first responder for 15 years. The tones go off in the station. I still get butterflies. We're rolling down the road and I'm still questioning myself, making sure like, okay, I know when I'm showing up, like this is what I need to figure out, but I got the butterflies. The moment we're on scene and I'm in it,
it's fine.
It's gone. And then I'm like, all right, I'm cruising. My brain unlocks. All the information's flowing in and I'm like in that flow state, right? It's
the anticipation of that. That's a little bit nerve wracking, but that never goes away. And it also kind of signals to you that you're in the right place. You know, if the bell goes off and you're just kind of like, whatever. Okay.
Right.
Maybe it's time to step away.
Right.
Like if you don't respond with that kind of hyper alert, slightly anxious response, you're probably not in the right headspace.
Yeah. And we see that in people. You'll see someone who's taking a very routine and they start to get very disconnected and jaded. It's a big problem. I imagine in the FBI line of work as well. People are in that environment, the stressful environment, the type of things you have to see, like the violence, the terrorist threat. It sounds so tireless or so restless. It's just like when can people take a breath? And I'm sure mental health is a major struggle in that field as well.
I think it is. I think people are hopefully getting better about ideas like self-care and kind of being a little bit more open, at least with themselves, about getting help when they need it. We come from a kind of a hardcore culture historically, mostly male, a lot of, it's a paramilitary environment. So, there's no crying, you know what I mean? Kind of that sort of ethos. But I do think that people hopefully are kind of putting some of that nonsense behind us a little bit now. The Bureau has, I think, tried to be a little bit more proactive in the last decade or so in terms of the services it offers to people. We see it even in the other side of the work that we do. We do a lot of work with witnesses and victims of crime. We have a whole division that does that in the Bureau. And they're just like a godsend to, they respond to any like mass shooting or mass casualty event, and they help the families of victims and witnesses reunite with their loved ones or reunite with their loved ones' remains, and process the kind of messy logistical issues that there are around that. There's nobody like practices, what am I going to do if my kid goes to a concert and gets shot?
Right.
It's an incredibly desperate time. So we have professionals that are part of the package that we deploy to those things, or people who are really focused on working with victims. So
that's encouraging to hear. It's a more comprehensive understanding of what all happens after something like that. It's not just staunch the bleeding sort of response. It's
collect the evidence and leave.
Right.
It's more helping people kind of
it's way more human, it sounds like.
Cope with that level of disaster. It's tough.
Right. We want it to be more human like that. So that's encouraging to me. I want to talk a bit about the world and the current state of things. So now you're no longer part of the institution of the FBI. You're
That's correct.
A private citizen, but you are getting engaged. You're not just riding off into the sunset from what I hear. So you're getting engaged in the cybersecurity space.
That's right. I have a, a consultancy that I am a partner in with my very good friend and partner, Greg Crabb. Greg was also a federal agent. He was a U.S. Postal Inspection Service agent. And for the last 5 years of his career, he was the CISO for the U.S. Postal Service. And so Greg and I do a variety of consulting with clients on cybersecurity issues. Excuse me. Greg is really more the technologist of our partnership, and he does a lot of work as like rescue CISO type of work. We'll go into a company who's in between cybersecurity leaders and help them kind of stabilize and figure out what they need to do next. We also do work with clients on helping them use intelligence more effectively, and that's really more in my wheelhouse. Helping, it's tough for companies to really kind of just, pull the signal out of the noise and understand there are so many threats, there are so many concerns that institutions need to be worried about, but what's really important in my business, and how can I get the intelligence and use the intelligence I need to keep my stuff safe?
Yeah, that's a very important conversation. What you just keyed in on is like, what's important to my business?
Right.
And I'm excited that there are people entering the cybersecurity fray with a background that doesn't lend itself immediately to cybersecurity, right? Because people tend to think of cybersecurity as ones and zeros.
Yep.
It's technology focused. It's about, the people working on the computers, as you see in the movies, hacking away and whatnot. And there's a profound disconnect that I've seen in my career between those technologists and the people who can influence decisions, like boardrooms, executives, business owners. There's it's exciting that there are people that are there to bridge that divide and help people understand, hey, when we talk cybersecurity, we're not just talking about your computer system and making sure it doesn't get hacked. We're talking about the data that's critical to your business. We're talking about your ability to deliver on your contract, on the services you sell. We're talking about the resiliency of your business in the modern world. I think people are starting to get it, but I think it comes a lot better from someone with a background like you than maybe some of the technologists who struggle to communicate at that level.
Yeah, that's really the gap that we're trying to fill. What we've done is we've taken the kind of traditional intelligence cycle, which is the process that every competent intelligence agency uses to collect and analyze and communicate information to decision makers, right? It's basically how you work intelligence. We've taken that and adapted it to a private sector cybersecurity context. And so the first step is identifying and defining your threats. But the second step is prioritizing the assets you need to protect, because that's the only way you can make that connection. Like, okay, here's all these threats out here, but which ones are the ones that I really need to focus on, right? What kind of business are we in? What kind of information do we need to protect? What sort of market share are we at risk of losing? How many partners are we dependent upon in our supply chain who might be presenting risk to our information, our technology, our customer base? So it's a way to kind of focus that application of threats to what you really need. Then you go out and collect information that's relevant to those
even after a
threats.
career in the FBI, you did law. And I think you said in your book, even like you held every job an agent could really hold. In the FBI.
Yeah.
You've done it and you're retired. You still can't get away from wanting to be in the action.
No, at all.
Right. Because I think about what you could be doing. You're a CNN contributor. You could do that. You could do leadership talks. You've been in high level leadership at a major institution. You could be out there as a, sort of a public speaker, just doing the circuit. You could write books about FBI stuff. You could, so many angles, but cybersecurity.
Yeah. I mean, like, I guess it gets back to what we were talking about before. Like, if that's your inclination, you want to be kind of a watcher, right? You want to be on that wall. You want to be helping people defend and protect themselves. You kind of never lose that. And so I definitely enjoy doing that from this is a very different perspective than I used to, but it's great because I feel like I get to keep my hand in that side of life. And the CNN work is a little bit like that too, like constantly trying to stay up on issues that are the law enforcement and intelligence issues that I get asked to talk about. Forces me to stay current.
Also, your podcast, I know, covers a lot of legal stuff.
Yeah, we have a podcast. My co-host Allison Gill and I have a podcast called Jack, where we basically talk about the 2 special counsel investigations, the Jack Smith investigations. And so I got to stay up to date on all the things happening in those cases, which like every week it's another handful of crazy things.
It's a saga.
It's a total drama. But that's going well. People are enjoying the podcast.
Yeah, so just no quiet retirement for James McCabe.
No. I just have like 100 little things that I do in 50 different directions. I teach at George Mason, as I mentioned, a class in national security law and policy. In fact, I just finished this semester last night, my last class. So yeah, it's just it's great. I used to have 37,000 people I was responsible for. Now I have 1. It's much simpler.
Yeah, and you don't have to schedule where you're going with an armed guard and SUV.
I drive myself everywhere. I got, it's very DIY.
Yeah, you've had like both extremes.
That's right.
And so you've been. I keep thinking back. You've been in these extreme situations. You've been, this close to President Obama, and now you're this close to me. And I'm not.
There you go.
I'm not on the same wavelenth.
This is much more
different.
cash. Yeah,
for sure.
Totally different vibe here, which is great. Yeah.
So that's just. Fascinating story, your career and where you're at now. And like I said, I'm excited to see people come in and get in front of boardrooms with gravitas, because you certainly have gravitas to your resume, your presence and everything. And I imagine them coming, or you going into those rooms and explaining to them why they should care about something like cybersecurity is probably making some real waves.
Well, as you know from your work, cybersecurity isn't cheap. Right? This is
you heard it here first. It's not cheap.
It requires an investment on the part of the board and the leadership of any company. It also comes with a not insignificant amount of impact on operations, right? You can lock down any system completely and be 100% secure, but you'll render it basically inoperable.
That's right.
So there's a balance that you have to kind of shoot for there in terms of maintaining your flexibility and functionality, but also doing it in a way that's going to preserve your enterprise and your assets in the long term. So I feel like it's really important to try to help boards make that decision and to kind of do it in the context of, rather than just like trying to respond to the last attack and trying to, buying the thing that's going to fix the last problem you had.
Yeah.
Let's think about looking forward to protect you from the threats that are on their way and try to be a little more proactive than reactive in that work. Maybe you can make more intelligent investments that way in your business and your security, and everybody benefits.
So one of the things I think you can probably help with, the information security world struggles to communicate these things. I've seen it, and I've learned a lot of what not to do from seeing how people generally approach a business leader with a cybersecurity problem in their very binary technologist way. And I've seen the business leaders I
glaze over.
Yeah. What are you saying? Why should I care about this?
Yeah.
Right. What advice would you give to people in this space as they're trying to communicate this to business leaders and executives to get that investment, to get that buy-in, that political willpower to get things done?
Yeah, you've got to, this is the fourth step in our cycle that we work with businesses on. It's about communicating to decision makers. How, like, you've done the work, you know what the threats are, you figured out what you need to protect, you're collecting the information you need. How do you now sit down and have those conversations in a productive way? It's not that different than the same way that you prepare to brief a president or your boss or, the head of the FBI if you're running a big counterterrorism case or something like that. It's first, you have to know your facts. You've got to be the master of your information, and every different direction that conversation can go, you need to be prepared to go there. But you've got to be economical in the way that you present the issue. And you have to do it in a way that makes sense, that is like chronologically relevant. Don't bury people with details. Don't gloss over big issues with not enough detail. There's a balance to strike there, and always be ready to go deeper if your CEO or your audience, whoever you're talking to, needs to go deeper. And another kind of rule of thumb not to be overlooked is don't ever go in with problems without a solution. Doesn't mean you have the perfect solution, but you have got to have a plan. It's better to have options, present a range of options, and make a recommendation on the one that you think is most important. Nobody likes someone to come into their office or their conference room and just dump a problem on their face. Right. Like that.
Call it tossing a grenade. Just toss it in and walk away.
Exactly. You got to be. It's an opportunity to show that not only are you dialed in and you know what the threats and the problems are, you're being proactive, but also that you're capable and competent enough to come up with a proposed solution. Like, even if they choose to do something else, just coming to the table with that sort of an option, it presents you as a solver of problems, right, not a deliverer of bad news. I
think that's a super important distinction. And I've had that lived experience in one of my first leadership roles. Was briefing a board of directors for a company I was working at. And the previous cybersecurity person had gone in before me, went in with something of a typical, like, hey, the sky is falling. Yep. I need resources. I need money. Give me what I need. And didn't really present a calm, like, path forward with options. And so I saw that go over very poorly, and they invited me in. And I was like, okay, well, why don't I try something different? Why don't I go in and I'll be to the facts, like you said, show them, here's where we're at. Here's our maturity level. Mm-hmm. It's not great in this area. It's pretty good in this area. Here's what we're doing to address that. Give them sort of a plan forward, and not just raise the red flag, but said, hey, here's a red flag, but right, I've got a solution. I need you to green light it. And this is what I need specifically from you.
And here's how why it's important to your business. Here's absolutely why it's not just you're solving the security guy's issue. This is why this matters to the entire enterprise.
Right. I was able to tell them, like, hey, this is part of our contract. Here's what could happen if we're in breach of that contract. Here's right, the money, right? And give them what they need. And very thankfully, after that meeting, after that board brief, the chairman of the board at the time came out and shook my hand and said, hey, you got carte blanche. Whatever you need from me, you got.
Yeah.
And he was a pretty big, he was conservative. And he really wanted people to prove what they needed. And to get that was like light bulbs off my head. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is how you communicate it. Give them hard facts, know what you're talking about, like you said. Be prepared to dive in, but you don't need to beat them to death with a PowerPoint.
No, but you've got to be able to inspire confidence in your capabilities, in your knowledge, in your ability to think around problems completely, not just, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, throw me some money. So yeah, those things are all super important, particularly when you're talking to an audience, CEO, board, whoever it is, that are not technologists. You don't want to I think cybersecurity folks often make that mistake. They kind of assume that the entire room is at their same level of knowledge, and that can be really off-putting to people. And so you surely don't want to do that.
Yeah, I find we connect very well with people who are not technologists when we talk at their level.
Yep.
And you can give them a little bit to demonstrate that confidence. Let them have that confidence in you enough that they can follow, but they can see what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Here's an example that would be relevant to your life because your wife, a doctor and their bedside manner. The most impressive doctor that I've had a very approachable, friendly, got down on the patient's level, talked to them like a human, and then would say, hey, here's the medical word. Let me explain what I really mean by that. As opposed to some I've seen come in with this very distant manner, very sort of superior almost, and say rattle off all these medical terms, and we're going to do this procedure, not explain anything. And you have a patient just what's going on? Am I under a major life threat? No, we're just going to do, a quick check of your heart. We're going to check your blood, make sure everything's healthy. And such a difference in what the confidence you get from a practitioner when they talk to you in your language.
Totally. And I think people have a really sharp, innate sense of authenticity. And so if you come in and you are trying to swing higher than you really are, impress with your knowledge and things like that, people see through that very quickly.
Especially people in those rooms who found their way to those rooms.
Yeah, you're not sitting at that table because you just walked in off the street and don't know what you're doing. So there's a lot of really good things to think about. I think everybody's style in those situations can be a little bit different, which is why it's helpful to work with a coach or kind of an outsider who can kind of counsel you on things to emphasize that you're already doing and other things to maybe de-emphasize that you might be doing, different ways to kind of change your approach on having those conversations. But yeah, a lot of it comes down to, just a kind of ability to read the room and be able to kind of pick that level that you need to be at to be most effective. Jim Comey, who I worked for, obviously at the Bureau when he was director, he had a way of doing this that I thought was incredibly astute. He would sit down and have, when he was new in a position, he would sit down with his subordinate leaders one-on-one and just talk to them about their lives, just a way to get to know them, right? Just a nice thing to do. That's something
very human, again.
Very human, something that a connected, engaged leader would do. But it also gave him an opportunity to ask a question. He would say, and I know this because he said it to me, tell me your story. Just an open-ended, where are you from? What are you about? What do you like? What's important to you? And with that incredibly open-ended question, he would see where people would come in. And some people would be, you don't want to be just I'm a nice guy, love being here at the Bureau. What about you? That's too high. That's too wave top, right? Others would come in and say, okay, I was born, on the third day of the month in May of 1968 in a small hospital. And, too much detail.
For sure.
What he was assessing was your ability to just instinctively hit the right level on transmitting information. And some people were really good at it. Others needed to work at it a little bit more. But there is a range, right? And you have to be able to kind of make that instant adjustment kind of on the fly.
I think some people think that only comes naturally, but at least in my experience, I had to learn a lot of that soft skill.
Totally.
And I think it's a muscle that can be exercised into a level of comfort.
Yep.
Where I think a lot of people, it's very the concept of going into a boardroom and inspiring confidence. Well, a lot of people lack the self-confidence. So they're like, how would I ever go into a boardroom and do that? You can work your way through that. You can exercise this muscle.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, great writers are great writers because they're instinctively really good at it, but also because they do it every day.
Right.
Like it's a skill as much as it is an ability. And, functioning in these environments that we've been talking about is the same thing. You can everybody brings some suite of skills to that conversation. Maybe you're like super good on the technology side of things and able to handle every single question about that. That's good. Keep that in your pocket, but let's work on the soft skills a little bit. That's why I just think it's so helpful to have kind of a neutral outside kind of voice to go over with you what you're planning to do. What is your plan for this conversation, this pitch, this briefing, whatever it is, and kind of provide feedback on those things.
I hope people in the cybersecurity industry are coming around to the fact that we need people with soft skills on our team.
Totally.
There has been something of a culture, and there is still culture in cybersecurity and in the technical world of, it's the people with the highest skill set, the most technical depth rise to the top and become leadership and whatnot. And there's something of a disdain for people who aren't on the same technical level.
Yeah.
As you mentioned it.
Yeah.
They can be very off-putting because they communicate and almost lord it over others. Like, I've got all this knowledge and you don't. We need people to cross that gap. Whether it's going to be someone we can home grow from a technologist into that role, which is kind of where I feel I've gone with my career, or we bring in people who have the soft skills and we can bring them up to speed on the technical to do what we need them to do.
Totally. Like, every great team is made up of people with a different range of skills and abilities. And you really need all of them to be able to function at a high level. And cybersecurity is no different. Yeah, we need some like super smart, tech heavy, beasts who can sit there and find their way through the infrastructure and find the vulnerabilities and fix our problems. But if we can't get them the resources and the attention and the priority that they need to function in an organization, then, you're kind of lost. You've like kneecapped yourself there. So yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think it's really more of a leadership responsibility. And, nobody's got it tougher right now than leaders in cybersecurity. I mean, like CISOs are about the most miserable people on earth.
They're starting to get named in lawsuits.
Oh
it's starting to get pretty dire out here for them.
Yeah, it's rough. Like you're kind of target on your back day one. And you're the expendable person in the room.
Easy fall guy.
You're the fall guy. Every time there's a problem, and guess what? There's going to be a problem. No matter where you are or when it is, something's going to happen that you couldn't stop. And so they're under an enormous amount of pressure. They're getting hammered every day from 1 billion people in the industry trying to sell them stuff and convince them about things. So they're kind of jaded. So anything, that we can do to kind of help relieve some of that pressure and help them function at maybe a higher level is, I feel like it's a worthy endeavor.
Why do you think cybersecurity? I mean, why is this becoming such a huge focal point seemingly everywhere I see it now?
I think that's a reflection of how essential cyber capability has become in every part of our lives, right? And I think we're just really at the beginning, or maybe the first chapter or two of realizing how significant it will be if that infrastructure fails us. And you see it, perfectly on the geopolitical level. Like we talk about conflict between nations and we talk about it first occurring in cyberspace. Like it has become, the go-to, projection of power for all of the major players in the globe.
Would you say we're at a state of war in the cyberspace?
I'd say, really depends on how you define war. I think you could make a good argument that we're already there. And we've been there, at least with some people, at least with Russia, at least with China, to a lesser extent, Iran, for a number of years. We are definitely at that moment, that pre-war operational preparation of the environment, OPE as the military refers to it, with some of our adversaries. We know, even from the public statements we've heard from the intelligence community and the FBI in the last couple of weeks, they believe that the Chinese government is very actively positioning itself in our cyber critical infrastructure for that purpose, to be prepared in the event conflict breaks out between the United States and China. They want to be able to hit us first and effectively in taking out our energy delivery capabilities, our communication capabilities, all those things that we rely on are to impact our supply chain, to, cripple our economy, to make it harder to fight the hot war. And so I think we have to just, it's almost in an allegorical way. It's a symbol of how significant cyber has become in the day-to-day life of humans around the planet. And so it makes sense that we are thinking more defensively about cybersecurity. We need to. Anyway.
Yeah, it can feel so warfare, very kinetically, munitions on target, that kind of thing. Cyberspace feels so abstract sometimes. It's starting to get more real because they're targeting things like infrastructure and now, impacting water delivery,
right?
And like the essentials of life.
Right.
If they can hit us there, I think that really ups the ante for people. And I think people are starting to come around a little bit. I think it's still fairly abstract, though. I
mean, in addition to kind of inflicting pain on the civilian population, right, here in the United States, if we, hypothetically, if we find ourselves in a conflict with China, they have that ability through cyber means, but it also impacts the warfighter. If you can't deliver food, fuel, material, weapons, ammunition to your warfighters because the supply chain has been destroyed, because our economy is tanked, because they can't communicate with the ships at sea, you have a distinct advantage on the battlefield. So it's completely tied together, which is one of the reasons why I think it's so important if you are a leader of an organization, really of any size, to understand some of these kind of geopolitical machinations, because it does translate, sometimes in a very small and remote way, it can translate to your own business enterprise.
Absolutely. So we do, in my work, we meet with our clients fairly regularly and do something of a threat brief. And I work with a lot of small businesses who are tiers removed from, they're cutting the piece that goes on the piece that goes in the assembly that goes on the rocket, right?
Right.
They're pretty far removed. But in our brief, I always tell them, like, hey, here's what's happening geopolitically.
Right.
It has some effect on you because you're in that chain. Adversaries like Russia and China, they're smart. And they know the big prime contractors in the defense space and the federal space have money to spend on security teams.
Yeah.
They know you're kind of weak. And they know that if they can exploit you,
right,
they can move here and move here and move here. And they keep doing that, right? So
that's the way it works, right? That's the beauty of how they execute those plans. And it means that every link in that chain is essentially as important as every other link in the chain. And so, I think that those smaller enterprises, those boutique shops that produce things that are essential to our defense industrial complex, they are just as much on the target set as, your heavy hitters, because they provide entry into those systems, into those communications, and access to those files.
Yeah, and come breakout, if it seems like there's this gearing up toward conflict, there's certainly a lot of posturing around it.
Yep.
And if it were to happen, for the adversary to be in our country in this way, in our infrastructure, to be able to disrupt daily life, let alone disrupt munitions production, fielding weapons, logistics, getting, things where they need to be. One that feels like it's a breakout of total war at that level. Right? If you're going to disrupt us at that level, it's total war. And then at the other, it makes me feel like we're very vulnerable.
I think we are. But at the same time, I think like people have a tendency to think of these issues in terms of predictability. Right. We're all talking about like the return of great power conflict and US versus Russia, US versus China, China and Russia, maybe in some sort of an alliance. And we think about it from that perspective of like, will we end up in a conflict with either of those two actors? They forget about the fact that thinking about it, preparing for it, standing up our defenses, that is one of the prime ways that we resist ending up in a conflict, right? By maintaining a level of vigilance, a level of cyber hygiene and security across certainly our critical infrastructures, but across all of our industries is one of the ways that we become harder to enter into a conflict with. So it's preventative as well as defensive.
There's a great paper that I just read. I was going over this yesterday. The National Defense Industrial Association, the NDIA, has an annual report they put out called Vital Signs. And in that, they talk about a problem that we're having with the defense industrial base and how it should be a force of national deterrence. Our adversaries look at our industrial capacity and are deterred from engaging in conflict.
That's right.
But there's been something of a dismantling and a weakening of the industrial base. And then you have what COVID exposed about our supply chains and whatnot. And there's something to be said for maybe the increase in all the saber rattling and this gearing up, maybe because we do look weaker in our ability to use our industrial base to field weapons and engage in conflict. Everyone can kind of see it's not as strong as it once was, so that deterrence factor is going down. I
think there's definitely some truth to that. It's interesting on that background, you wonder what sort of messages our adversaries are getting from our ability to support Ukraine, right?
Of course.
So as we are able to ramp up production of ammunition and deliver effective technologies, I think we send the message to our adversaries like, hey, watch out, we're still on our game and we're giving this to them, but we still have what we need to protect ourselves. But as we struggle with things like funding or industrial capacity and things like that, we're sending the opposite message. Even on a political level, I believe that as we recede from positions of interaction and leadership on the global stage, we open up opportunities for our adversaries to step into those relationships, to take over those positions of leadership and influence. And we shift that balance of power away from the United States in a very potentially dangerous way and at a really sensitive time. So I don't know. I'm always a strong believer in engagement and partnerships and alliances to address these national security threats. And I think, the current performance of NATO in the Ukraine area is a good indicator of what we can do.
Let's talk about Ukraine a little bit. I don't know how closely you're following, but I've been following at a distance, largely from an interest in the way warfare is being conducted. You have it on the one level, it's very 1917. It's like trench combat, it's artillery, it's that sort of devastation, that human devastation level. But then you also have this insanely high-tech new war that's being conducted with the use of drones. I've talked to someone who I believe is going to come on the podcast who's on the ground in Ukraine and has seen that cyber domain and things like using telecom networks to figure out where people's social media is being accessed from, to then see, there's a troop concentration here, and you feed that to the guy on the artillery. Right. And so you have this now, it's not this just kinetic 1917 sort of thing. That is happening, but it's being coordinated and conducted on this very high-tech level.
I think the two aspects that you've highlighted there are indicative of the fact that things don't go from one place to another. They just increase generally, right? Things just get more complicated with the injection of technology. So the fact that we are engaged in this high-tech kind of drone-driven, satellite-based communications network supported warfare doesn't mean we're able to leave the world of 1917 and trench warfare behind. It's just adding to that scope and the bases that we have to cover or consider defending against when it comes to our own defense. So yeah, I think the challenges are certainly get greater every day on our military, particularly on our military planners and strategists, the people who have to figure out, okay, what can we learn in this case from Ukraine and the conflict there? How do we need to adjust our own defenses? How do we need to prepare to defend ourselves and to help defend our allies around the globe in the next year, 5 years, decade, whatever that might be. It's not going to get any easier.
From a counterterrorism guy, I mean, imagine looking at the state of technology and what you can do with remote technology like drones. I mean, I just see a litany of prospects for someone that wants to inflict terrorism on a populace. You have a lot more tools at your disposal.
And yet there's the 1917 side of it as well. It's still incredibly easy to just make your way into this country, arm yourself with military grade weapons, and show up at a large crowd, right? So the ability to strike out, to make a name for your terrorist group, to make some sort of terror statement by inflicting casualties or pain here in the United States is still incredibly easy. Now, on top of that easy to do DIY terrorist attack, you have everything that technology brings along with it. And, you know, in the counterterrorism field, you know, I really saw this from the front lines as we moved from, you know, when I started doing it in like 2000 and, I mean, it was 9/11, but when I came down to headquarters in 2006, you know, we were worried about these radicalizers who would like produce CDs and mail them to people. Like that's how you radicalized other people. You kind of, you know, recorded these
slow way of moving information.
Exactly.
That way.
You recorded these sermons and like hoped people would come to your website and they would send you some money and you'd mail them back a CD. And then that graduated to, you know, AQAP and Inspire magazine, the most effective terrorist propaganda we had ever seen. And then, you know, ISIS took it to a whole new level using social media and using social media to literally to recruit individuals who would then travel to the battle and fight or stage attacks here. So like we watched the development of technology, the ease of access to technology and communications. It's so easy to communicate from the battlefield in Syria to, you know, a young person in Northern Virginia. And so you just kind of have to like, you learn from that lesson and understand that we have to remain agile, even though terrorism, you know, has kind of fallen a little bit, I think, from the public consciousness here in the last couple of years. Hopefully the events in Israel from October 7th are a reminder that we still face significant terror threats. And as we engage in this case, helping the government of Israel address their threats from Hamas, we become more of a target of Hamas, right?
Sure.
Like there have been Hamas affiliated individuals here in the United States for years. And so how do we think about now the threat from Hamas to the United States, to Americans, which we maybe didn't prioritize in the past because of our focus on Al-Qaeda and ISIS? It's a tough sport to be in, to be a counterterrorism professional, and you're constantly trying to touch the pots on the stove and figure out which one's the hottest and you might boil over next.
So you're out of that institution now. Do you have confidence in those you've seen on your way out coming in, and you know the institutions we have now to deal with this new world?
I do. I know the gravity and the seriousness of what they're facing, and so I'm constantly thinking about them and praying for their success. But the institution remains what it's always been, which is a place of great, incredibly dedicated, hardworking people, and so that's the best building block you can have. You know, they need good leadership. And with that, they'll continue to fight for us, protect the American people, and uphold the Constitution. That's the mission of the FBI. I have no doubt that they will continue doing that. Be nice if they could get a little shelter from the political winds, because that's not helping them. It'll be good when people kind of get over the political propaganda and understand that people in the FBI are there to help them and protect them, because that mistrust or distrust makes doing the job a little harder. But they've been around for over 100 years, and I'm confident they'll continue doing it for another 100.
Glad to hear that. If Andrew McCabe's not in the FBI, doesn't have the storied career you've gone to have, what is Andrew McCabe doing today? Right? Where would your life have gone if not down this wild and crazy path?
Oh my God. God, I have no idea. You know, you do one thing long enough, you kind of lose the ability to see yourself doing anything else.
You'll like my follow-up question too.
Oh God. I don't know. I never really wanted to do anything else. Maybe I would have stayed in law. I probably would not have been very happy doing it. You know, I've always been a bit of a gearhead. I love cars. I love music. So maybe I would have thrown it all away and
been a motorhead, driving around playing a band.
Yeah, exactly. Who knows?
So my follow-up question, which I know you'll love, because it rings through in a lot of what's in your book, is where is Andrew McCabe without Jill McCabe?
Nowhere. Nowhere.
Does she know that?
Totally. Yeah. Best decision I ever made in my entire life, bar none, including every decision I ever made about anything else, was marrying that woman. She is just the absolute best. We are partners in everything. We've been through so much, like in the last couple of years, and yeah, we're just.
You've been through the fire.
Yeah, for sure.
A very real one.
For sure. Yeah. And it was hot. I'm not going to lie, but yeah, it just made us closer. And, any moment that I want to spend with her and with my two wonderful kids. I'm just incredibly lucky as a family. We've been through a lot, but we're very, very united and enjoy spending time together.
I know you described early as you're trying to transition to the FBI. She's one of the only supporters that you described. Like you had family and people around you saying like, what are you doing? You're leaving a lucrative law career.
Yeah.
Take this pay cut. The way you describe it, she didn't miss a breath.
Never does.
She just said, yeah, do it.
She never does. The only thing she's ever said I couldn't do is ride a motorcycle.
She's wise for that.
So I'm like, all right, you know what?
Well, she's an emergency room physician. She knows.
Exactly.
Yeah, she knows how that
She's like Captain Safety. So, you know, my kids, when they would go out like sledding in the wintertime, she'd make them wear their bike helmets. So my son, of course, refused to ever get on a sled. But yeah, she's an ER doc. So she's seen it all, as you know, from your EMT work.
I can say she's the real deal. It's funny how worlds collide. My other world in EMS and medicine, which is where I thought I wanted to go at one point before I went down this track.
Sure.
I worked at a hospital in the adults ER, but they'd occasionally need some help over in the pediatric ER.
Yep.
And I met your wife over a decade ago.
Yeah.
And she was one of my favorite doctors when they were like, hey, you need to go to peds. And I'm like, okay, who's there? McCabe. Oh, it's going to be a great night.
That's so nice of you to say that.
She's awesome. The best. Great bedside.
Yeah.
Man, when I describe like that physician that gives you confidence.
Yes.
They come in, they talk at your level. Great with the patient, great with the parents.
And you talk about steady under pressure. Oh my God, she's just like ice water in her veins, and some really tough moments. I mean, they see as you do as an EMT, you see people on their worst day.
Yeah,
you know. So yeah, she's incredibly steady and super smart, great doctor, and just a wonderful person. So I'm super lucky.
Sounds like it. So my last question to you. I use a phrase largely in marketing to say like it's a dangerous world, right?
Yep. And
our catchphrase is you got to get your shields up, be prepared for this world.
Sure.
It does feel like there is this amplification of, a trend toward conflict. There's gearing up. There's a lot of nationalism on the rise and sort of this thing's going on. So there's plenty there to be pessimistic about, but I wonder what gives you optimism? Because you seem pretty optimistic, all said.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is. We live in a very challenging world on all kinds of levels. And if we just focus on that, it can be kind of a downer. But you've got to look at like where we've been as a people, as a community, as a nation. We have come through so many tough spots in our history. And we've done it not because like everybody became a Democrat or everybody became a Republican. We've always had political differences. That's a healthy thing. But we've gotten through tough spots because we've been able to come together over the things that we agree on, which has historically been democracy and living free and independent lives, the application of the rule of law to everyone the same way. And I think those fundamental values that everybody still shares, we don't focus on them day to day. But if we do, I don't think there's any challenge that we can't overcome. And to have the right to have people in positions of leadership that embrace the things that join us together rather than things that pull us apart, there's absolutely nothing that this country can't do. And so, yeah, I'm optimistic. I think all this, a lot of the turbulence that we experience right now, I think it passes. I really do. And I think we get back to kind of being who we have always been and who we are and who we will be going forward. We'll never agree on everything. We're kind of a irascible family. You know, it's like a ugly Thanksgiving dinner every day here, but
little conflict's healthy.
And there's more that we agree on than things that we don't agree on. So that's kind of what keeps us going, I think.
I think that's a great note to tie it together on a podcast titled The Watchers. And we're talking about the people who are in basically positions of defending. Yeah, some days you're in the day to day and it feels very distant, but that's ultimately what you're in service of. If you're somewhere like the FBI or you're supporting a defense company in their cybersecurity department, that's what you're in service of, is ultimately defending and upholding, that democracy and that world we want to live in.
Totally. Greg and our company is 10.8 Cyber. That's of course, the law enforcement code for in service. And I totally agree. Here's to the Watchers.
So 10.8 Cyber, you've got a book called The Threat, which I know you can get on Audible, you can get on Amazon, wherever.
Yeah, it's out there wherever you like your books.
If you like audiobooks, he read it too, which is always, we were saying before we started recording, when an author reads their work, so much more satisfying.
I think so. I read it in a studio in Maryland at the same time that Michelle Obama was reading her book, like in the next studio over. I've never met the woman, but I was hoping a little bit of her successful fairy dust would fall onto my book, but she had all the Secret Service guys are around in the studio.
Someone has to go around with force.
Totally. But it was cool. A couple of days doing it. I enjoyed it, and so I'm glad you liked it.
So 10.8 Cyber, the book, the podcast, Jack,
and see me on CNN whenever you tune in.
That's right. Any social media or anything? LinkedIn?
I do no social media. I'm on LinkedIn, but I kind of ignore it more than I do anything with it. And I don't do anything else.
All right. Well, thank you for coming down and really appreciate you being the first, setting the tone.
Andy, it was a blast. I had a great time and just terrific conversation. And this thing's really gonna take off.
Here's hoping.
There you go.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Watchers. For more great content, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out our channel. We'll see you on the next one.